Welcome to a moderated discussion with Dr. W. Caleb McDaniel, author of Sweet Taste of Liberty, A True Story of Slavery and Restitution in America. My name is Haya Panjwani, and I am the MC for today's event. I'm currently a student at the University of Houston, majoring in political science and journalism. Today's program is entitled The Conversations on Truth, Freedom, and Justice, and is proudly being presented to you by the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Center. Through the guidance of His Highness the Aga Khan, the 49th hereditary Imam of the Shia Ismaili Muslims, the Ismaili Jamatkhanas in the United States are positioned to be more than places of worship and spiritual search. They are places of friendship, dialogue, and inclusivity, reaching out to neighbors to facilitate an exchange of ideas. This is achieved through hosting cultural programs such as educational seminars and lectures, art exhibitions, music and dance, and as a forum for civic leaders and others. At the opening ceremony of the new headquarters of the Global Center for Pluralism on May 16, 2017, the Aga Khan explained, and I quote, "Pluralism does not mean the elimination of difference, but the embrace of difference. Genuine pluralism understands that diversity does not weaken society, it strengthens it. In an ever-shrinking, ever more diverse world, a genuine sense of pluralism is the indispensable foundation for human peace and progress." End quote. These spaces hope to encourage community engagement and collaboration on issues of concern, as well as broadening intellectual horizons and fostering an appreciation of pluralism. Today is no exception, as we are pleased to present a moderated discussion with Dr. W. Caleb McDaniel. Dr. McDaniel is an author, professor, and the chair of the history department at Rice University. He also serves as the co-chair for Rice University's Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Injustice. Dr. McDaniel's most recent book, which is the topic of today's discussion, is entitled Sweet Taste of Liberty, A True Story of Slavery and Restitution in America, and is the 2020 recipient of the Pulitzer Award for History. The book chronicles the life of Henrietta Wood, a woman who was born enslaved, freed before the Civil War, kidnapped and re-enslaved, and then freed again by the war. In 1870, she sued her kidnapper in federal court, and in a rare case of restitution, a jury awarded her $2,500. Today's discussion will be moderated by Dr. Neelam Khoja. Dr. Khoja is a postdoctorate fellow at Yale University and a graduate of Harvard University with a research focus on historically marginalized communities. Without further ado, please enjoy the discussion.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I would like to personally thank the Aga Khan Council for Southwestern USA, and especially Dr. Caleb McDaniel. His book, A Taste of Sweet Liberty, has encaptured me for the past 2 weeks. I've read it, I've thought about it a lot. I have a lot of questions and a lot of different themes that I would like to explore with him. So it is my privilege and my honor to welcome him in this conversation today. Thank you for your time, and especially thank you for this wonderfully, beautifully written book.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you for having me, and been looking forward to talking with you about it.
So to get us going, I think a lot of our audience probably hasn't had the opportunity and the joy of reading the book yet. So just to get us all situated, can you give us a brief overview of who Henrietta Wood is, who Zebulun Ward was, and what brought the two of them together?
Sure. So Sweet Taste of Liberty is subtitled A True Story of Slavery and Restitution in America. And it follows the story of a woman named Henrietta Wood, who I first learned about in the fall of 2014 when I read an interview that she gave in a small town Ohio newspaper in 1879. And in that interview, she told the story about how, while living as a free woman in Cincinnati, Ohio, before the Civil War, she was kidnapped and enslaved by a man named Zebulun Ward, who was actually a deputy sheriff in Kentucky at the time, just across the Ohio River from Cincinnati, where Wood lived. As a 19th century American historian, it was not sadly surprising to me to learn of the kidnapping of a free Black woman into the domestic slave trade. This happened quite commonly, and historians now believe that perhaps as many people were kidnapped from the lower north into the upper south as managed to escape in the other direction on the well-known Underground Railroad. And so, although that was not surprising to me to learn that a woman like Wood might have found herself in the clutches of a man like Zebulun Ward, what did surprise me was the way that her story ended. Because after the Civil War in 1870, she had managed to return to Cincinnati after a very long ordeal that took her to Mississippi and also to Texas during the war itself. And she filed a lawsuit against Zebulun Ward. The case ultimately was heard before a federal court. And in the end, after many years of litigation, she managed to win a judgment against Ward in the amount of $2,500, which is the largest known sum of restitution ever paid by a United States court to a formerly enslaved person in American history. And so that's the story in brief of Henrietta Wood. And reading that in the fall of 2014 immediately captivated my attention and sent me on a long search for as much as I could find about Wood and Ward in order to write this book.
Yeah. I think one of the most captivating things was this idea of how their lives are so entangled across such a vast geography. Right? They cross so many different states, and yet somehow they kind of come together again and again. And a lot of it is because of the legal actions that Henrietta Wood is able to take. I wanted to kind of delve out a little bit more of the details of what even led to the first lawsuit that Henrietta Wood had against Ward. So can you give us a little bit of a background on that?
Sure. And, I learned more as I did more research about the full span of her life as well, because the interview that I mentioned where I first read about her story began with her kidnapping. And so it wasn't until about a year later that I was able to fill out some of the details about the rest of her life. I learned that she was actually born enslaved in Kentucky around 1818 or 1820. She was at that time owned by a family known as the Towseys. Moses Towsey was a farmer in northern Kentucky who enslaved Wood's mother. And so, according to the laws of the state of Kentucky at the time, any child born to an enslaved mother would also be enslaved. And so, Wood lived until she was about 14 on the Towsey's farm. But then, when Moses Towsey died, she was sold away from her family and separated from them for the first time. So in terms of geography, even before she ever her life ever intersected with Ward's, she was taken down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, Louisiana, hundreds of miles away from where she had lived as a child and from her family. And she worked and lived there for about 6 or 7 years. Enslaved by a man named William Sorode, who was a merchant there in New Orleans. But ultimately, William Sorode returned to France. He was a French immigrant, and he fled some creditors in the city of New Orleans who were trying to make him pay some debts in court. And so he fled. He left the country and went back to France. And that was a key turning point in Wood's life, because Sorode's wife, Jane Sorode, was left behind and remained in control of some of the people that the family had enslaved, including Wood. She returned to Kentucky with Wood and later moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. And so in 1848, Wood made that fateful crossing of the Ohio River and became a free woman in Cincinnati, a state where the laws were quite different from the laws in Kentucky where she was born. in Ohio, slavery had been outlawed by the state's constitution from its earliest years, and she was required to register as a free person if she wanted to be employed in Cincinnati. And so in 1848, she later remembered receiving official freedom papers that certified that she was a free woman, and she later referred to that period of her life in Cincinnati as her sweet taste of liberty. That's the origin of the title of the book. For the first time, she understood what it meant to be a free woman, and not to see slave sales happening in the streets as they would have in New Orleans or in the places she had lived in Kentucky. But at the same time, her freedom was precarious, and I think it's telling that she referred to those years as a taste of liberty, because she still was doing the same kinds of work that she would have done while enslaved to the Serodes in New Orleans. She was working for very low wages or no wages at all in boarding houses and families in Cincinnati doing domestic work. And because she lived so close still to a state like Kentucky where slavery was legal, she and other free people living in Cincinnati at the time were always in danger of being kidnapped and re-enslaved. And that's exactly what happened to her in 1853, only 5 years after she had obtained her freedom in Cincinnati.
Right. So can you tell us a little bit more about Zebulun Ward and his background? Why was he the kind of prime person whom Henrietta Wood could have sued? So as you say, there was two fateful crossings in my mind. The first was when she first gained freedom, and the second is when she is, without her knowledge, taken back downriver, back into Kentucky, and then sold into slavery yet again. Mm-hmm. And here, Ward plays quite an interesting role, not just as the person who purchases her, probably knowing very well that she was a freed woman, but also someone who makes a mark on slavery in a much different way, and that is through the prison system. So if you could please give a background on that.
Sure. So Ward had actually been born in Kentucky, not very far from where Wood was born, but of course he lived a very different life, as a white man in Kentucky, as a citizen of the state, as somebody who could pursue in a way his own version of the American dream, to try to get rich quick, and he did that in a variety of ways. Before 1853, he had worked on steamboats on the Mississippi River. He had participated in the California Gold Rush. He was sort of dabbled in a variety of different commercial enterprises. And then, as I mentioned earlier, he had become a deputy sheriff in Covington, Kentucky, the sort of sister city to Cincinnati, right across the Ohio River. And by that time, he had married and started a family, had begun to acquire enslaved people of his own. But I think when he heard about the possibility of taking control of Wood, he saw it as another way to get rich quick. If he could kidnap Wood, if he could bring her across the river, if he could sell her quickly to one of the many professional slave trading firms that was operating in Kentucky at that time, then he stood to reap a gigantic profit from doing that. What he didn't count on was Wood being courageous enough to talk about what happened to her. And so after that second crossing that you mentioned, when she was lured into a carriage and taken across the Ohio River, within hours of her kidnapping, she had started to talk to anyone who was sympathetic or seemed sympathetic to her about how she was a free woman, that she was not legally enslaved in Kentucky, that she had been wrongfully brought into the state, that she had been wrongfully enslaved. And because of that, there was a freedom suit that was filed against Zebulun Ward in Kentucky in the 1850s, that ultimately Ward won, partly because those freedom papers that I mentioned earlier, the kidnappers had managed to steal the only existing copy of those papers. And so the court ruled in his favor. And that's partly because, as you mentioned earlier, by that time, he was a fairly prominent man in Kentucky. He had gone from being a sort of upwardly mobile, trying to engage in all kinds of get-rich-quick schemes, to somebody who was an officer of the law and who in 1854 was selected to be the manager of Kentucky's state penitentiary. So by the time he won this judgment demonstrating that in the eyes of the state of Kentucky, Wood belonged to Ward, by that time he had taken over the state prison system in Kentucky. And so he was, not just any white Kentuckian, but also a very well-connected and increasingly wealthy man who profited not just from the enslaved people he owned, but also from the exploitation of prisoners who were working in this state penitentiary. He was an architect of the convict leasing or convict labor system that later spread to many states across the country, partly because he, after the Civil War, assisted in implementing it in other states as well. He managed the state penitentiary in Tennessee for a time and also in Arkansas, and really showed why it could be so lucrative for a private contractor to take over a state prison system and force the prisoners to work for his own profit. That's exactly what he did, and why he had become very wealthy by the time they met in court again after the Civil War. And even though he had won this earlier case against Wood in the 1870s, in the second case, Wood ultimately prevailed.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting that the verdict for the first case ironically becomes the reason why she wins the appeals in the second case. And I think that's nice justice, at least in that sense. But before we continue on with the story of Henrietta Wood and what happens to her when she's enslaved for a second time, I want to talk about things like larger sort of ideas about genealogy and family history and belonging. I think what struck me a lot was in the conversation about her kidnapping and then her re-enslavement was the question of, where are you from? Right. And you do such a beautiful job of trying to piece that out for enslaved peoples. This idea that they are robbed of an identity. Most didn't even know who their father was. A lot of times children were taken from their mothers, so they never had the love and the care and just general being nurtured, even suckled by their own mothers. On the side of who the father is, of course, is very it's unknown. The fact that slaves can legally married, of course, added to this. The fact that they were separated and sold off as separate units, of course, mattered. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how does a historian piece together a history where there's so many silences. There's silences of genealogy. There's silences of, we hear very little about Henrietta Wood and how she was feeling most of the time, right? You do a beautiful job of piecing that together with, through an empathetic lens of trying to say, like, she might have felt this or she might have felt that, right? But we don't actually know. She didn't leave a memoir for us. You have to kind of piece it together. So I'm wondering, as your task as a historian, how did you do this? What were the things that you had to rely on to flesh out the very skeletal outline of her narrative?
Thanks for that question, and I think it gets to the heart of slavery as a system of domination and power. You're right that the records that slaveholders kept and wanted to have kept in the antebellum period were not the kinds of records that would have preserved the sorts of things that historians would most want to know about enslaved people, who their family ties were, what they were feeling at particular moments of time. And that was very much by design. I mentioned earlier that the laws of the state of Kentucky held that anyone born to an enslaved mother would also be enslaved. And because that's the way the system was set up, as you mentioned, the paternity of an enslaved person was not always important for record keeping purposes from the perspective of slaveholders like Ward. All that mattered was who the mother of the child was. And so it does create challenges for any genealogist or any historian who's trying to reconstruct a particular enslaved woman's life. And I think grappling with that is an important way to see what slavery did and how it dominated the lives of people who were enslaved. That the archive is itself an artifact of the power that slaveholders exerted through the legal system in this period. But I think that against that silencing, there were always efforts by enslaved people to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a determination to keep their own memories alive of their family relationships. And Wood's a great example of that. She remembered her parents' names and passed those names down to her descendants. And of course, she, as I mentioned earlier, had the courage to speak about what happened to her after her kidnapping, and then also to go to court after the war and swear her affidavits, her story of what happened. And then she gave, in addition to the first interview that I mentioned, she gave a second interview as well to another newspaper reporter in Ohio in the 1870s. And so those interviews were crucial to me as a historian, because they gave a glimpse into her own way of telling the story of her life. Not a perfect lens by any means, because she was prevented throughout her life from being taught how to read or write. Mm-hmm. So she couldn't commit her story to paper in a memoir of her own, but she did speak with these newspaper reporters who wrote down what she said. And in the book, I explore some of the reasons for having a lot of confidence in her memories. There's other sources that can corroborate what she said in those interviews, that can demonstrate that they do represent to some extent her own words and her own memories. And so for me, it was a process of using those interviews as sort of a launching pad, or a Rosetta Stone, if you will, with which to understand the other sources that come from these very fragmentary archives, where she appears in the record more as a commodity than as a person. And I think trying to reconstruct her life as a person, and not only as the property of Zebulun Ward or William Sorode or Gerard Brandon, another man who claimed her as his property, is the challenge that any historian of an enslaved person faces. But you're right that it's a challenging task, and certainly I wouldn't want to claim that it's a finished story, or one that might not be told a different way by someone else looking at the same sources, because it requires a certain amount of filling in the gaps, of reading against the grain, of trying to take everything that we know or can learn from the larger archive of enslaved people and memoirs that we do have by formerly enslaved people, and then using that to try to read between the lines of what we do have about Wood, and draw some tentative conclusions about what she might have felt at particular moments in time.
Yeah. I want to get back to this idea of commodity and using slaves as, they, at some point in the book, you mentioned that slaves are worth $3 billion, which was more than the infrastructure in place, any other economic activity that the United States at the time could have, accounted for. And again, tying it back to this idea of silence and silencing, others. When in the Ismaili community, one of the ethics of our faith teaches us to respect all humans with dignity, give human dignity, like human dignity is a big value for us. You treat every person with respect and dignity. What's interesting as you read this is that in the mind of the slaveholder and in the mind of the pro-slavery, that ideology, they are not human. And so it's difficult to kind of wrap your head around. There's this entire ideology and practice, and it's institutionalized to the point where they are a commodity. They are to stay silent, right? Even in the first lawsuit, in the first court case, she describes herself in one of the interviews as sitting as like a stick, right? Like an inanimate object. And then after she wins the second case, when a reporter looks at her to gauge her reaction, he says that she's like a marble statue, right? Both inanimate objects, as if even then she has been freed. Even then there is this idea of not being fully human, right? And so I want to kind of talk about this. So what does it mean to have so much wealth accumulated in slavery? And then the steps that one could take. So emancipation, I think you do a very great job in the book of showing the layers of emancipation, the long emancipation, as some scholars have, talked about this time in history, how long it took the states to actually ratify the amendments that were required to, come back into the United States and with the recognition that slavery was to be abolished. So just thinking about all of this, I'm really curious to talk about how do we, reparations is one thing, and she definitely was a beneficiary, and so were her progeny. So did Arthur Sims, and then his children and grandchildren, they benefited from this. But on the other hand, that ideology of the dehumanizing of Black people persisted, and it continues to persist, right? So how do we battle that? What do we do about the silencing of this?
Yeah, there's a lot there to think about. I think you captured well one of the central facts about slavery, that it involved the commodification of a human being, and all of the paradoxes and contradictions that resulted in. And also I think you hinted at the fact that in the American context, even though slavery is an ancient institution and appears in many world cultures, in the United States, it was a racialized institution as well. And so what one Supreme Court justice later called the badges and incidents of slavery continued to attach after emancipation to African Americans, to Black people in the United States, because of the way that slavery was understood as a racial system in the antebellum period. And so Wood's life, I think, exemplifies that larger phenomenon. I think that when we think about slaveholders like Zebulun Ward and the laws of antebellum states, there was always sort of a contradiction in the law itself. There were laws that recognized enslaved people as property that could be bought and sold, that could be passed on as an inheritance to white descendants, as even property that could be used to secure a mortgage. Things that might be difficult for us to grapple with or think about today. But at the same time, other laws, acknowledged that enslaved people were people, that had children, that had family relationships, that could even be held accountable for murder in some cases, in some states. And so historians of the period have tried to think about what does it mean to have a legal system that treated people as property, and then at the same time, in other contexts, treated property as people. The historian Walter Johnson refers to enslaved people in this period as people with a price, and all of the paradoxes that entailed. In Wood's case, when she has this lawsuit in the 1850s, attempting to demonstrate that she was free, the laws of the state of Kentucky, if you think about it, how could somebody who was considered property bring a lawsuit before a court and sue to demonstrate that they were free? Well, there were sort of legal fictions at the time that held that if a person claimed that they were wrongfully enslaved, that they were actually a free person who had been deprived of their freedom and was being wrongly treated as property, they could sue. But if the court found against them and found that they were actually enslaved, well, then they were property, so they couldn't have brought a suit to begin with. And so the case was just dismissed, just wiped from the record. And I think that's indicative of the contradictions, that you were speaking about. And I think you're absolutely right that a system that contorted, a system that went to such great lengths to deny the humanity of people of African descent was not a system that could be undone overnight, or whose consequences could be easily repaired or redressed. And certainly one of the things I hope that the readers of Wood's story will think about is what it would take to redress a crime as extensive as the system of slavery in the United States. I think at least one part of that repair would include reckoning with what happened and talking truthfully about what happened, as we have, I hope, been doing here. Trying to reconstruct as best we can the human lived experience of people who went through that system. It is partly about money when we're talking about reparations, and certainly Wood, when she sued Ward, was seeking some monetary damages for everything that had happened to her. But I think it's also about a larger reckoning, a larger exploration of history, of trying to tell the story as fully and honestly as we can as a country, as a way of acknowledging the damages done.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a tough thing. I think even one of the things that struck me was in the second case, all of the chatter that was obviously present in the newspaper clippings from all across the United States. A lot of people thought that this was not the right time, that she had waited too long to seek reparations, or it hadn't even been that long, right? And here we are, centuries later, right? Because slavery began so early, 400 years ago. So centuries later, we're here and we're having these conversations, and so many people want to say, well, that was in the past. It's not happening now. Why should we be held accountable? But I think I think, as you rightly say in your epilogue, even then it was they had that same argument. There were so many people who wanted to just forget about it. They felt like that they won, emancipation happened, states ratified, we're done, the story is over. For me, as someone and as a historian, I think the present really presses on us in terms of the kinds of questions we ask about the past. As Michel de Certeau says, like, every history is actually about the present. It's not really about what's happening in the past. So I was thinking about like the current climate, and I think reparations is certainly one, but as you talk about, it's the actual awareness and reckoning that we need to kind of come to. And with that reckoning, I think as we look at Ward's life is another point that we can draw on. His life, his actions in a prison system, which continues to plague mostly people of African-American descent till today, right? The vast majority of people in prison today continue to be of African-American or African-American or of African origin. So I want to kind of pivot and move towards the economics of the time of Ward, and where the exploitation of labor kind of comes into play, not just slave labor, but and in the book you also talk about how she's leased out for work, right? So the person who owns a slave could even lease out someone and actually benefit from this. But in the prison system, the amount of wealth he was able to gather, and we start seeing states that are privatizing, right? And he is a big factor in this as well. So maybe we could start talking more about.
Yeah, that's so true. And by the time he died in the 1890s, he left an estate to his children worth some $600,000. And so, if we were to translate that into today's terms, he would have been a multimillionaire. And most of that money he had earned through running these state prisons in Kentucky and Tennessee and Arkansas. And especially after the Civil War, that's really the origins of the racial disparities that you were mentioning earlier in the prison system in the United States, because after emancipation in many southern states, white politicians and planters devised new ways of exploiting the labor of formerly enslaved people. And they passed laws, for example, that sentenced those convicted of petty crimes, stealing $5 worth of property, or even people who were really guilty of no crime at all, but because of the color of their skin could be arrested and then subjected to a highly discriminatory judicial proceeding, not unfamiliar to someone like Henrietta Wood from before the Civil War, and then find themselves in the state penitentiary, and then find themselves leased out to private contractors on cotton or sugar plantations to do the same kinds of work that they had been doing before. And then that would enrich the person who was leasing the prison system. And in the case of Tennessee and Arkansas, that was Ward. This wasn't confined, by the way, to those states. And in fact, here in Texas, in Houston, just outside the city in Sugarland, Texas, many people in this area have recently been following the story of the Sugarland 95, which are the 95 victims of the convict leasing system whose remains were discovered on a piece of ground owned by the Fort Bend Independent Schools District in Sugarland. And that sort of, I think, renewed some public attention to the history of convict leasing and how close to us geographically it is here in Houston, but also how close to us in time this history is. I think, as you noted, this isn't something that happened a long time ago, even though that's often the way that white Americans in particular talk about the history of slavery. And as you note, that's how they were talking about it even in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, that this was a distant chapter. It's time to move on. It's time to close that part of our history. But I was really struck in researching the book again and again by the resonances and the echoes of the past and the present, and really by how close this story is to us. I had the privilege and honor of meeting one of Wood's great-great-granddaughters before she passed away in 2018. And you mentioned earlier the name of Arthur Sims, who was Henrietta Wood's son, born in slavery in Mississippi after her kidnapping and re-enslavement. But he went on to a long life in Chicago. And before he died, his great-granddaughter, who I met, lived in the same house with him until she was about 7 years old when he passed. And so when I was able to speak with her in her home in Oakland, here I was talking to someone who had living memories of Henrietta Wood's son. And so I think that really exemplifies and illustrates how close in time this history was to us. It's not something that was distant. And so it should not be shocking to us that the consequences of systems like convict leasing, systems like slavery, continue to exert an impact on the structures of our society, and require us to think hard about how to root out the the legacies of slavery and convict leasing from our present day institutions, our present day policies.
Right. Yeah. So in the second case, she wins a little bit over 10% of what she asks for, is $2,500.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you say, probably allowed Arthur Sims to purchase his first home in Chicago. And I think what was nice about this story was not only showing what could happen to a family if reparations had been made at that time, but that reparations in itself is actually still not enough, right? Because eventually the house that he buys is still redlined. So the value of that housing market where he purchased a home and other people of color purchased homes actually doesn't inflate, like the value of the property doesn't go up as much as it would have if it was an all white neighborhood, right? I think even today there are these studies that show that homes that are appraised that are Black owned home versus white owned homes, even if they're in the same, zone, are appraised at a much lower value than they are, right? So yes, the reparations certainly helped this family, and yes, they were able to live what we would call a middle class life. But crossing that threshold still, there were other structural things in place that prevented this family from progressing even further, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And in debates about reparations, when you hear some people say, as you alluded to earlier, that, oh, well, that happened a long time ago, or I never owned slaves myself, or my family never did. I think that sort of way of thinking fixes the conversation on the history of slavery, when, as you point out, there was Jim Crow segregation after the Civil War. There were policies like redlining, so housing discrimination, differences in the way that the federal government awarded mortgages and appraised property in the 20th century. When I first learned about Wood's story in 2014, that was the year that Ta-Nehisi Coates published an award-winning magazine article, "The Case for Reparations," that I think is really worth reading if anyone in the audience hasn't. And it explores some of the history of redlining and some of the impacts of racism even beyond the end of slavery. And so claims about reparations today are not just talking about 19th century slavery, but also about all of the things that followed in its wake. And so I do think that you're right that it's kind of hard to decide in some ways at the end of researching this how to regard this $2,500 that she won, because on the one hand, it does seem hardly sufficient to cover all of the things that she had endured, all the things that she had suffered, and it wasn't even as much as she had herself demanded in this lawsuit. On the other hand, I think her story shows that even a small amount of restitution could make a big difference in the life of a family, particularly because it was invested in a house and real estate, that could become a real source of wealth that could empower upward economic mobility for Arthur Sims and his descendants. And so, I think sometimes we get caught up in thinking about reparations today with questions about, well, how much would reparations be, or who would be paid, and how much would be enough. And I think sometimes that distracts us from the possibility that even a small amount could be very impactful. And I think especially if it were paired with a reckoning of the kind that we were talking about earlier, an acknowledgement and a full airing of what's happened, so that it would be meaningful and would be more than just a sort of a token payment, but actually it would be paired with a real acknowledgement of what happened in our history. That's a powerful possibility to contemplate and think about. But I think you're right that in her case, it's hard to really close the book on her own experience and say, she won reparations. I very self-consciously use the word restitution in the subtitle of the book, even though initially I was thinking about this as a case of reparations.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, in doing the research about the book and thinking about the history of her family, I started to rethink that choice, and in large part too because even though, as I said earlier, there's interviews that Wood gave, there's a lot that we have to get some insight into her story. It's also true that her last interview that she gave in 1879 was published before she had even received the money from Zebulun Ward. And after that interview, she doesn't appear, as far as I can tell, in the historical record again. And so if we're wondering the question of, well, did that restitution amount to reparations? Did it really redress what she had suffered? Before I answer that question myself, I would want to know how she would have answered that question. And unfortunately, that's another example of the silence in the archive. We don't know how she regarded her victory and whether she viewed it as sufficient repair for what she had endured. And so I think you're right to say it's kind of hard to conclude definitively that this was enough. What she won, even though at the same time it's significant that she won. It's rare to find a formerly enslaved person to receive even this amount of justice in the courts. And so I don't want to diminish either the real extraordinary nature of what she did achieve. And as I said earlier, the implications that even that small amount had for her family. But hopefully, readers of the book will ponder with me how to regard this final victory.
Yeah. I mean, it begs the question, how many Henrietta Woods were there? How many were persistent like her, fighting like her? And how many of those case files have been misplaced the way hers was, right? Like in the epilogue, you describe, as any historian could, empathize and has experienced something like this, where you're waiting impatiently for a file, and if it's not found, how devastating it would be on someone's work. But thinking about how many Henrietta Woods were there that would have had a legitimate claim and could have also benefited. And even there, again, we have silences, right? We don't know. There's a precarity to even the documents that preserve this. And I was wondering about precedent, right? So you say she was it was probably the earliest where we find that that the award that she sought was actually given to her. Even the appeals agreed with the decision that the jury made. How many times do you think, or I'm not sure if this is something you've looked into, was her case used as precedent in the, afterwards? How many times did she, how many times was it used? And the other thing that I want to kind of explore is, like, when we talk about an unevenness of justice, or unevenness of even what it means to be slave, the state lines, the going down south across river, every time you cross a river, it seems to get worse and worse, even in terms of fear and rumor, if you get sold downriver, it's worse. And when emancipation happens, then they move west towards Texas, right? So there's a lot of unevenness in the states and the state laws, and what it means to be a free person or an enslaved person. It could change. If you come to Ohio, it's possible you could be seen as a freed person, right? And after emancipation, even more so. So I want to kind of talk about how do you as a historian go, there's so many different archives, there's so many different courts, they get moved around. This case that was tried in one state, the files are actually in a different state now, right? So how do you kind of piece this together? And in your search, did you find other cases like Henrietta Woods?
Well, to answer that last question first, I had a lot of help from dedicated archivists and librarians who work hard to try to preserve these documents and make them available to researchers. And so, it's a credit to many libraries and academic institutions, state archives, we really need to support those kinds of organizations in order to find stories like Wood's. I think there's a lot of talk sometimes these days about erasing history or retelling our past, but I think the real way to erase history is to not fund archives that preserve these kinds of sources, and so that's really a critical tool for historians like myself. And it's challenging, and for some of the same reasons that it was challenging for Wood in the antebellum period because of the federal structure of the U.S. government, the fact that we have federal laws, but also 50 states now, and fewer then, of course, but each state with its own code and its own laws, and that had a direct impact on the kinds of justice that she was able to seek in the antebellum period. And I think it limited the weight that her case had as precedent for other suits as well. Even though her case was heard in a federal court, it began in a state court. And the reason she was able to sue initially was partly because she had been free and could argue that she had been wrongfully re-enslaved, that she had been kidnapped. But absent that first moment, she might not have had the legal standing to bring this suit. She made clear in the lawsuit that she thought of it as a suit about slavery itself, not just about the kidnapping. But the vast majority of enslaved people who found themselves legally freed at the end of the Civil War had not had an experience like hers of obtaining freedom and then having it taken away while slavery was still legal. And so her case was unique in that way. And I don't rule out the possibility that other cases like hers might be found by historians digging into the archives and waiting in those reading rooms for the file to come back. But I think the commentary from the newspapers at the time made clear that many contemporaries realized what an extraordinary case it was and how remarkable it was that everything had sort of happened just right, even to enable her to return to the scene of the crime, as it were, to find Ward, to file this suit, to have lawyers who would make the arguments and stick with it. And so in that sense, her case was very rare and unique in ways that limited its ability to serve as a precedent later. So today, I think many advocates of reparations are rightly concentrating more on legislation at the federal level and seeking some solution that could transcend state lines and also that could put it on a more secure footing than the kind of litigation that Wood was engaged in the 1870s.
Yeah. So I guess we have time for one final question. What's next for you? What are you working on now?
Well, right now I'm climbing a very steep learning curve as chair of my department here at Rice. And of course, all of us in higher education are dealing with all of the disruption as everyone else is from the pandemic. And so that's occupying a lot of my time. I'm also here at Rice co-chairing a task force on slavery, segregation, and racial injustice, which is an effort by the university to reckon with our own past and to look into the entanglements of our history with slavery, segregation, and racial injustice. So those are the things that are occupying most of my time right now.
I was secretly hoping you were going to write a epilogue or like a second book, but focusing on Arthur Sims. I found him to be so fascinating. Just his involvement in community matters, but also as being a very long, he practiced as a lawyer for so many years. I think there's so much to be said and about him, his life, the time period, having been the son, enslaved himself, but also freed. Your graduate students will pursue it.
If I do, I'll be sure to credit you for the idea. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Your book was a pleasure to read. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet, please read it. It's called Sweet Taste of Liberty by Caleb McDaniel. Thank you so much, and back to you.
Thank you, Dr. McDaniel, for a truly insightful discussion. Having the opportunity to get your insight on the issues highlighted in your book has been extremely valuable. On behalf of the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Center, we also want to thank each and every one of you, our participants, that joined virtually from across the United States and abroad. We hope that you found the program to be as valuable as we did. To get more information about the Ismaili Jamatkhana and Center, please go to the.ismaili in your web browser. For more information on upcoming programming, please go to facebook.com/theismailiusa. We look forward to sharing future programming with you. Thank you.